So I make pop-up paper dollhouses, and when I recently made this SpongeBob themed one and showed it to the internet, I was completely overrun with comments wishing that I documented more of my process. So now that I'm embarking on a new and even more ambitious pop-up paper dollhouse for Bob's Burgers, I decided to make this in-depth tutorial showing how I made the prototype of the dollhouse shell that I will ultimately scale up when I make the final dollhouse. And unlike my SpongeBob dollhouse, which had a very simple book-like opening, this dollhouse will expand out more like an accordion in order to better mimic the elongated layout of the Bob's Burgers building on the show. So if you've seen any of my beginner pop-up paper dollhouse tutorial content on how to make basic little 2-wall pop-up room boxes, please throw that knowledge on the back burner because these rooms will be constructed a little bit differently. Anyway, let's get into it. So I started by taking some 65-pound A4 size cardstock and cutting it into 4 strips that are each 2 inches wide. Each of these strips will ultimately become a block of 4 pop-up rooms that are 2 rooms high and 2 rooms wide. So however tall I want the individual rooms to be, this strip needs to be twice as tall. Because I'm just making a small scale prototype here, the rooms will be 1 inch square, which is why I need the strips to be 2 inches. When it comes to the length of the strip, I want the length to be 6 times the width of one room. So for 1 inch square rooms, that means I need 6 1-inch segments. Here I'm using a scoring board to give each strip a series of firm creases to split that strip into 6 1-inch segments, and then I'm cutting off the excess at the end of the strip. If you don't have a scoring board, a sharp fold with a ruler will work just as well. Now I took each strip and flipped it the other way to give it a light score line down the center, which in this case is 1 inch. The strips won't actually be folded along this line, and it's more of a visual guideline than anything, so no need to make a hard crease here. And you could honestly just mark the line with a pencil instead, but I like a score line because then I'll still be able to see it even if I color over this line. This line will be the boundary between the rooms on the first floor of our dollhouse and the rooms on the second. Now that I have 4 wall strips sectioned into 1-inch squares, it's time to make the floor segments. And again, because I'm creating 1-inch square rooms, I want the floors to also be 1-inch square. However, I also need a way to attach these floors to the walls. So I'm cutting a set of strips to be 1 1/4 inches wide. I cut a bunch of strips because I knew I was going to be messing some of these up in a little bit, but you could probably get away with like 5 strips if you're better than me at being precise. Just like the last set of strips, I'll be segmenting these with deep creases on my scoring board, except the pattern this time will be 1 inch, then 1/4 inch, then 1 inch again, another 1/4 inch, and I repeat that over and over until I reach the end of the strip. Then I flip the strips the other direction and give them another deep score line at the 1 inch mark so I get something that looks like this. Next, I'll be cutting these strips apart along every other crease line until I get these 1 1/4 inch squares with 1/4 inch creases on 2 sides. Then I take those squares and I cut out this little tiny square in each corner where the crease lines intersect. So I'm left with a perfect 1-inch square floor with foldable 1/4 inch tabs on 2 sides. I ultimately need 16 of these floor pieces for this project since I've got 4 strips of 4 rooms each. But I made a bunch because next I need to give each of these a perfect diagonal fold from the corner between the 2 tabs over to the opposite corner, and I knew some of these would be more perfect than others. I used a ruler and an embossing stylus to do this, and then I followed up with the bone folder for good measure because again, when it comes to pop-up, you really want things to fold as easily and flatly as you can get it. I did this for all of my floor pieces, and then I picked out the 16 best ones to use as my floors for this prototype, and then it was time to move on to the next step. Now at this point, if this were the real dollhouse, it would be time to put down all the wall colors, all the flooring, all the trim details, all the flat decorations like paneling or windows or rugs, because it's going to be much harder to draw on these details once this is constructed into a 3D shape. But since this is just the prototype, I kind of just scribbled some color on here to give the general idea of each room from the show that I want to include. Hopefully now you're better able to visualize how each of these first set of 4 strips that I cut becomes a block of 4 rooms with 3 walls per room. And for this project, those rooms will be the restaurant dining area, which will actually be 3 rooms wide, the restaurant kitchen, which will be 2 rooms wide, and then 1 room each for the restaurant bathroom, the employee bathroom, the staircase that leads up to the 2nd floor apartment, the upstairs hallway, the upstairs kitchen, the upstairs bathroom, the living room, and then bedrooms for Jean, Tina, Louise, and Bob and Linda. And I showed the inspiration pics for these rooms in a recent video on TikTok, so go ahead and check that out if you're curious to hear more. Pre-assembly is also the time to do all of your cutouts between rooms, like doors, archways, windows, etc. But in this particular style of pop-up paper dollhouse, some walls are more structurally important than others, so quick sidebar while I show you what I mean. There are exceptions to this, especially as you become more advanced, but for the most part in basic pop-up paper dollhouse construction, your pop-up furniture needs to attach to a wall and also to the floor at any point on the same side of the diagonal floor line as the wall you're attaching it to. In this dollhouse where I have these blocks of rooms with these third walls in between, the third wall is purely ornamental. If you were to attach furniture to this wall and then to the floor, the dollhouse would not be able to fold up. So when it comes to cutouts between rooms, you can cut into this third wall as much as you want without impacting the function of your pop-up furniture, and you can even cut it out completely if you want to. But for your 2 primary walls in each room, each cutout you make will mean less places where pop-up furniture can be attached, and you can't cut these walls out completely because they're necessary to actually make the pop-up furniture pop up. You can still cut into them, just be mindful about how you intend to lay out your furniture. Anyway, now that I've given you some background, here are the cutouts I made for this particular dollhouse. It's probably hard to imagine right now when we still haven't attached our floor pieces, but the first 2 wall segments on the left side of our strip will be our primary walls for the rooms on the left. And our last 2 wall segments on the right side of the strip will be our primary walls for the rooms on the right. And these 2 segments in the middle will be our ornamental third walls. Because I'm combining 3 rooms across 2 strips to replicate the size of the dining area in the show, I started by cutting the third walls out of this strip completely. The walls between the second and third segment of the restaurant dining area, however, are primary walls, which means I can't cut them out completely, especially because I know I'll need something to attach the restaurant booth seating to. So instead, I just cut a large doorway between them. Because this doorway is between 2 separate room strips, I lined them up back to back in the place where they'll connect, and I cut the doorway through both layers at once. This is a prototype, so I'm not being very neat here, but you get the idea. The next wall that had to go was the wall between the 2 segments of the restaurant kitchen. And again, this is a cut between primary walls between 2 strips of rooms. So again, I cut a large doorway instead of cutting the wall out completely. Much later, post-assembly, I'll remember that I also wanted to cut a little window between the kitchen and the second segment of the restaurant dining area, like the serving window in the show, and it was a real struggle to cut it out with assembly already underway. So all that to say, just make sure to think ahead about every cut you need to make at this stage before moving on to the next step. Now it's time to start attaching the floor segments, and for the bottom floors, I attach them with the tabs to the back side of the walls like so, and this way the tabs won't be visible from the front. The floors for the second floor rooms, however, can't be hidden in the same way. So instead, you need to decide if you want to be attaching them with the tabs facing up or with the tabs facing down under the floor. Whichever direction you go, you'll want to color your tabs to blend into the walls they'll be attaching to. You could also disguise the tabs as baseboards or crown moldings, depending on which way they face. I opted to glue mine in with the tabs facing down, so I colored the backs of the tabs to match the walls on the first floor. Make sure you're using that line we lightly scored earlier as an indicator of where these floors need to be glued at, or you might end up with floors that don't fold up the way they should. It's also important to make sure you're attaching your walls in the correct place with the diagonal facing the correct direction. The floors for the rooms on the left side of each strip will be glued to the first two walls with the diagonal floor line pointing to the right. The floors for the rooms on the right side of each strip will be glued to the last two walls with the floor diagonal angled toward the left. And when attaching the floors to the rooms with cutouts, you need to make sure you're cutting out the same section from the floor tabs so it doesn't show through the cutout hole. At this point, you can really see it starting to come together, and you can also start to get an idea of how this will ultimately fold closed. Once you've got your 4 strips of 4 rooms with 4 floors each installed, it's time to start combining them together into the final dollhouse shape. But first, we need to cut out a few more pieces, and for this, you'll need a thicker cardstock like this, 120-pound cardstock. Ideally, you'll want to use white cardstock, but I use this brown cardstock just so you could tell the difference between the two paper weights in this demonstration. So I took my thicker cardstock and I cut a strip that's 2 rooms wide, which in this case is 2 inches, plus an extra 1/4 inch. Technically, I only needed 2 inches, but I wanted to give myself a bit extra in case everything doesn't line up exactly perfectly right. Then I cut it again the other way at 2 inches tall, and I took the sides of this cutout rectangle that are 2 1/4 inch wide, and I marked each one at the center, which is 1 1/8 inches, and then I connected those marks with a pencil to create a center guideline. And you'll want to flip this over and do the same thing on the other side as well. This piece of cardstock is going to become the center support wall for the final dollhouse, with 2 room strips attached back to back on either side. Now, for both sides of this particular dollhouse, I cut doorways through these center walls. So now I need to cut the same holes into this thicker piece of cardstock. Make sure you know which room strip is attaching where, and then take each one, line it up with the back of the central pencil guideline, and trace the doorway onto the cardstock. Then take an exacto and cut out the doorways, and I cut them slightly larger just to make sure none of this brown cardstock peeks through. Now it's time to start gluing the room strips, again using that center guideline to line them up back to back on each side. I'm just using basic white craft glue here. Then I trimmed away the excess cardstock that was sticking out on either side, and I was left with this noodly 4-legged spider of an unfinished dollhouse. Now I need to cut out 2 more pieces from this 120-pound cardstock to create the front and back covers of the dollhouse. And I want these to be as wide as my dollhouse, but a little bit taller. So I cut them out to be 2 and a smidge inches wide and 3 inches tall. If this were the final dollhouse, I would be decorating them to look exactly like the front and the back of the Bob's Burgers building, and I'd also be cutting the top to match the shape of the building facade. But for now, we're keeping it simple. Glue the pairs of loose ends of the room strips onto the front and back cover pieces respectively, and make sure you're paying attention to which end of your dollhouse is the front end and which is the back. Now we're getting close to a completed pop-up paper dollhouse shell, but you'll notice that this shape does not want to stay together on its own. And in fact, the pressure it requires to get those third walls to fold up between the rooms like I want them to ends up making the folded floors start to fold themselves up. So I need a little cheat to get this thing to hold its shape. And I decided to experiment with using these tiny 1mm magnets, although you could use tiny clips, paper tabs and slots, grommets and ribbon, or whatever kind of fastener you can think up. I placed these magnets on the top corners of each primary wall that wasn't glued down to one of the thicker cardstock pieces, and then also to the top middle of each of my ornamental third wall segments to pinch those together as well. Later, I also added magnets to the center bottom of each of my third wall segments just for good measure. I attached these magnets with some basic craft glue and a lot of swearing, and was only about 90% successful in the end. So I think when it comes to the real deal, I'll be using a stronger glue for these magnets, and probably also larger magnets to match the larger scale of that final dollhouse. Also, I attach these magnets to the front of my walls and not to the backs, because even just a tiny little magnet like this is enough bulk to throw off the angles that the pop-up mechanism needs in order to fold out completely. But in the final dollhouse, I will probably disguise these better by covering them with thin printer paper colored to blend in with the color of the walls or something to that effect. The very last thing I did with this prototype was experiment with utilizing this extra space behind the building facade on the front and back covers as a potential attachment point for a fold-down attic, which I did by taking a piece of 65-pound cardstock, the same 2-inch width of my cardstock covers and twice as tall as the remaining space, and then folding it in half. I decorated it with marker to look like the attic in the show and added some magnet attachment points to hold it in place when it's folded up, and I could even attach pop-up furniture in here if I wanted. So there you have it. This is the final Bob's Burgers pop-up paper dollhouse shell prototype. In the final dollhouse, this is the point where I would start making and attaching all of my pop-up furniture and creating all of my paper dolls and doing any other finishing touches. But I'm going to save that energy for making the real dollhouse, so you'll just have to check back to see how that turns out. If you want more info in the meantime on how pop-up furniture is made, you can check out my beginner pop-up paper dollhouse tutorial playlist on TikTok. Anyway, I hope this walkthrough of my prototype was helpful, and if you have any questions, suggestions, or just pop-up wisdom to impart, feel free to drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.